Okay, in this tutorial we're going to be looking at how to create a detailed diffuse texture such as the one applied to this model. So you'll have access to this model and this texture as well if you just load them up on Moodle. Okay, so if we just go to Photoshop and have a look at our texture, you'll see we've got different groups here of the different types of layers on our model. So if you just turn all of those off except for the colour layer, you'll see the initial approach to the different coloured sections. Now obviously the first thing to do is to actually output a unwrap of this model. So you may want to do that just for so you have this as reference if you're going to work through this with me. So we can see there's our model there, and notice I just had to set my selection filter to geometry because it was selecting something other than geometry like a spline or a box, or a dummy, and wouldn't let me apply a generic unwrap to it. And obviously to output this, usual here, and this is a 2048 map. And we can see we do have some overlapping because there are some parts of the UV that are overlaid. Okay, so just so you have this as a reference, we can quickly fire that up and paste that at the base of our model here. Normally you'd put it at the top obviously, but just so you can see this. Hopefully that's not included in the group there. I've decided to put that in the group, so I'm just going to pull this up to here. And put that to there. So now I can turn off the colour and see the UVs. Okay, so let's just first of all talk about the colour layer. The way this was done was just use base colours, so picking our kind of base colours here and then adding in detail to that. So you can see there are a lot of kind of detail layers that are included here. And this is kind of the best way to start really. Just gradually building up those colours using different paint effects, different brushes in Photoshop. So like a common way I was approaching this one was to say select the green area here, colour pick on the green, and then using a different value, so working my way up diagonally on my colour palette, and then either desaturating it or just kind of painting that straight on. It's probably a little bit too strong there. And the thought here was really to kind of create that kind of paint feel to it. So I do have like this specific brush that I was using for creating this effect, and using the same brush that applied to an eraser as well, to kind of erase bits of that out. You are best off using a Wacom for this, obviously. And then kind of turning down the opacity of that a little bit too. So just to show you I call that brush the paint fade brush. Shape dynamics, just had that set to pen pressure. The original brush shape, I was using this one here. Dual brush, I had linked to this brush here, just to get that opacity on the fade. And transfer as well, I am using transfer set to pen pressure, it's just that I haven't got my Wacom installed on this PC at the moment. And obviously this is set to pen pressure too. So I was kind of really using a mix of that brush to kind of generate all that. all that different detail on that layer. So if we just save that as it is, and come back into our Mac scene, make sure we're actually using that layer, sorry, that texture. We can see here what the base colour looks like. So obviously it's very useful to kind of use this stage to make sure you've got the right kind of colour balance and colour palette used on your model. Okay, so that's creating that initial base colour. So the next thing we'll look at is doing some decals. Now you can either obviously paint some images yourself, but if you're using something like text, of course you can do that in Photoshop. And what we're going to look at here is just a nice easy way of, so I'm just going to get rid of this. Okay, so if we make a new layer here, I'm just going to drop in something here, and we'll just drop in a random number, and we use something like that. And obviously you want to pick a colour that's kind of suitable. You could go for something like white, but kind of always best to do something off-white if you are going to go for white. For a couple of reasons. One, it gives you that ability to change the colour value of it later if it's in pure white, and also because this is supposed to be like an old kind of ramshack building, so that's the kind of thing you actually want to have. You want to have it kind of off-white, so it's not going to be kind of perfect. So I'll make that a little bit bigger. In terms of the font, I've got a lot of random fonts installed, and one useful thing you can do to toggle between the fonts, you don't have to keep dropping down like this. If you just select the text, in fact you might not even need to select it. We'll just try that real quick. Yeah, you do need to actually select it. Then if you left mouse button in there, in the text thing, you can actually browse up and kind of pick the font that you want. So it makes it a lot easier to kind of toggle between your different fonts using this technique. So I've got a lot of kind of custom fonts installed, and all of these are from 1001freefonts.com, and some of them you can go through and you can check the commercial rights. So if you can use them commercially, then you're all good. Okay, so once I've got the base decal done, you can then right click on the layer and go to rasterize type, and then go to convert to smart object, and now you've actually got this as a layer, and you can start using well, actually you will need to rasterize it as well, but it will warn you about that too. And then you can start using your different brushes to edit this. So even if we take something like this and just apply a bit of scattering to it, maybe something like that, we might be able to then just erase out some little bits of this to make it kind of feel more like it's sitting, actually been painted on, and it's just kind of worn away a little bit. So when you are doing decals, it's important to kind of consider that. We'll try and make them look like they are actually kind of part of the actual texture. So yeah, just that small little difference you can see has a big kind of impact on it. And because we left some colour information in there, we can even apply a colour balance and get a bit of a change to this. Well, obviously I didn't apply enough, so that didn't quite work. So what I can do, if I do want to change the colour of it, even though I've rasterised it, is just hold Control, click there, pick the new kind of colour I want, B for brush mode, and you can paint that in, like so. And then you can actually apply a colour balance to this, hold Alt, left mouse click to assign that colour balance just to that layer, and then you can tweak the colour of it. You're going to do what you want with it. So yeah, that's kind of a rough way to kind of approach doing decal maps. So making sure you're always thinking about how you're going to make the decal actually look like it is part of the object. Obviously there are other ways to do decals in post, such as UDK. I'm just showing you how, if you need to, how you would paint them onto a texture. Okay, yeah, so you can see this typical kind of thing there on the decals too. One thing you might want to think about is something like bits of paint drip and stuff like that too. Okay, so another little touch here is to add things like cuts and scratches. Now you can either do this in ZBrush, but you can also do this in just in Photoshop. And to do that, I was just kind of going around here and painting on the bits I wanted it to go, and then again just using the eraser to take these kind of right down to small bits. And again, making sure you use that value to do it as well. So don't just pick a random colour. But if you go to B for brush mode, hold Alt and click on a colour, then left click in your colour palette, then you can just go up and down in your value. Just kind of add some extra bits in, and then just D for eraser and just take these right down. And that just adds that kind of little bit of fine detail to your texture. Okay, so leave that decal off. So the next thing we're going to look at then is how to do the rust layer, which is kind of the most important thing in this texture. Also, I've got a few old textures layers that I wasn't using there, I believe. I'm not sure if that's still needed, but we'll leave it there for now. So to do the rust, if we just have a look in our rust layer here, you'll see we've got several kind of different layers. Now there's really only two components to the rust. If we turn all that off and turn that back on, basically you've got the rust itself, and then you have this which kind of creates that outer glow. So if you just look at kind of an edge around here, it creates that kind of slight highlight around that edge, which really kind of brings the paint out a little bit. But really the most important thing to look at here is this mask. So if you just hold Alt and click on the mask, this is the layer that's bringing the rust through. So anything that's white, rust comes through. So if you just paint something on here, like a little smiley face, you'll see we're getting rust coming through on there. We'll just undo that. And to make this easier as well, the other thing we're going to do is just merge down some of these rust layers. So I might do this already on yours. So I'm just going to delete the layer masks off these. I'll delete that one. I'm just going to make it one rust layer to make it kind of easier to work with. I'm going to copy that, merge that down to there, and there we can see our rust coming through. You can see on this one it's actually applied that as a layer mask, so I'm going to need to delete that and assign that down, and then reapply a mask and paste that in. So I'm just going to disable that mask. Let's just have a look at the rust layer. So really simple thing here, this is just derived from some kind of rust photos that I took, and then just clone stamped, and the levels kind of equalised to create that kind of rust colour. So it's the only kind of actual photo reference that's used in this texture, and really you could paint the rust yourself entirely anyway. I was just kind of pushed for time, so that's why it was originally derived from a photo. Okay, so there's our rust layer. So how do we actually create this mask? Well, to do this we use a mix of Photoshop and ZBrush. So if we come back into Max, what we're going to do is work through that pipeline. So we will select our base model here, and we're going to export these. So you should have a project folder for this, but I'm just going to stick these on the desktop originally. And also, if you have GoZ installed, obviously this is much easier. Use ZBrush as a preset, and we'll just export a couple of the assets here. So maybe these clamps as well. And we'll export this too, so export, and we'll call this TA panel. So if we fire up ZBrush, what we'll want to do is import each of these assets. Obviously this is far easier if you have GoZ installed, because you can just do this with one mouse click. Make sure that when you drag into the view that you turn on edit mode, and then when you import the rest of the assets, if you just go to Polymesh 3D, import, and select the others, and then back to this Polymesh 3D, import, and select the panel. So you should have all three of them here. And then if we just go to Subtool, we can hit append and bring in each of these assets. Okay, so we can see already that's now got our clamps in there and our side panel here. Now if you have any problems with this on your models, it'll be because of things like your pivot and various other stuff. So if you just make sure that you reset transform scale, reset X-form, convert to edit poly, and then try again, you should be okay. Also notice that the pivot for each of my models isn't actually in the same place, but it still brings them in all okay, so it's not normally that's the problem. Okay, so all we need to paint in ZBrush is this black and white mask. We already have the rust information here, so all we need is this. So in ZBrush, a good pipeline for this is to first of all make sure that you have your brush tab, in your side panel here, and you have your alpha tab in your side panel as well, because these are the main controls we're going to use. We're going to make our own custom brushes and using our own custom alphas, so having these kind of easily accessible is important. Okay, so we're going to paint the walls first. So another important thing to do is to actually just start making sure you remember to save this tool. So if I just go to Save As, and just to show you, even though I'm not using the right folders here, I'd actually have a ZBrush folder, and in there I would have a Tools folder. I would call this TA kind of rust masks. That means we can load that up anytime it crashes or whatever. So we're going to start by working on our walls. So if we come over to geometry, as you know, to actually paint in ZBrush you need to have geometry in your model. And another important thing is to make sure you have smooth turned off, because if you divide with smooth turned on, it changes the shape of the model and therefore won't affect the won't apply to the UVs correctly. You can use smooth UV, but it's just not worth it because we want to maintain the UVs of our original low poly model. So I'm going to divide this very high, probably up to whatever 10.918. The higher it is, the better quality the final texture, so we do want to keep it that way. So the next thing we're going to do then is set everything up for painting. Now first of all, good to use this matte cap pearl. It's a nice kind of even material, so you know exactly what you're painting. Next thing is to turn on Z add, because that's going to sculpt on our model, so we don't want that, so turn that off. And then turn on RGB, because that's what we want to paint. We want to paint red, green and blue information onto our model. The next thing to do is to check your UV map. Now see it's 2048. You can actually go all the way up to 8192, but we only need 2048. So if it's any, make sure it's always set to the size that you want your final texture to be. Then in Polypaint, if we turn on Colorize, we should now be in color mode. I'm just going to try painting. Now nothing's happening, and that's because I'm painting white onto white. So we can see here now that is actually painting. Another important thing to show you, because this can catch you out sometimes, if you go to Texture Map and you have a texture applied, when I'm painting nothing's happening, and that's because the texture is sitting on top of the paint. So we'll turn that off. Now I can paint again. Okay, so just to show you how I was working here, if we come to Alpha, we'll go to Import. What a good idea to work here is actually just to create a ton of custom alphas. So I come to Brush Alphas here, so Walkways. You see I've got a load of different alphas that I can use for painting. So if I just load one up here and start painting, maybe increase the size of my brush a little bit here, you can see I'm already painting on some of that rust information based on the alpha. Also I can switch colour here and actually start to take bits of this out to avoid any of that kind of tiling. Now with Rust it's very important that you use reference imagery as well, because Rust is very kind of dynamic, almost like a living thing. So it's very difficult to replicate it kind of realistically in 3D, particularly without kind of reference imagery. So for instance, I've just based off my past experience, I know there would be more rust in this corner here, and then it would kind of fade out a little bit because that's where kind of more water is going to gather. And this is why you need to have your other models in the scene with you as well, because there's going to be rust kind of coming down here, there'll be rust gathering under here as well, and obviously in this kind of corner as well. And obviously one thing to note is you have to be careful with ZBrush kind of painting onto the other surfaces here. Obviously one thing you can do is like mask areas out like this and mask these out like so. So if you mask out these walls, then obviously you can avoid kind of ruining any kind of paint information you've already done. Another way to work actually, rather than do it like this, is to, you notice now, painting on there, it's not affecting that side. Another way that I actually like to work sometimes is to actually just paint one wall at a time, export that alpha, apply that in Photoshop, and then come back in and and paint the next wall. So I will actually go through that with you in this tutorial as well. So I just want to take that out like so, and then paint over that bit there. And obviously one thing I forgot about there, if you hold Alt, you'll actually paint in your alternate colour. That makes it much easier.